Okay, so I want to talk about the debate between Sargon of Akkad and Kristi Winters. This is actually one of these videos that I've really been looking forward to making ever since I watched the debate, which is a couple of days after it happened. And the interesting shit in this, I think, is going to be the bit where I'm talking about the different feminisms and the different ways in which feminism is used. Certainly that's the interesting bit to me, but I know people will want to know what I thought about the debate. Okay, so I'll get that bit out the way first. I've actually done my hair. I'm so looking forward to this video that I've done my hair ready for it. It's kind of a sad indictment to my hair that I have to tell you I've done my hair so that you know, but I've done my hair. Sad though that may seem. And sad though it still looks. So, right, this was a debate. The motion was, is feminism good for the world? The two sides was proposing it's good for the world. Kristi Winters proposing it isn't good for the world. Was Sargon of Akkad, and it was hosted and moderated by the Skeptic Feminist. They had a difficult job because the remit was set out. They were going to have 10 minutes each to outline their arguments, then the old 5-minute rebuttals. And they'd set it so you had to put your references in advance, and that you had to stick to those references and keep citing them all the way through, and anything that wasn't cited would be dismissed by the moderators. That's a really big fucking ask they took on board there. Don't think it was a wise move, really. If they tried to enforce it, I think they'd have ended up like a soccer referee, in that they'd have been, both sides would have felt hard done by. You'd have had these decisions that effectively you've got to make live without recourse to reviewing them, and both sides would have felt hard done by. It would have been a very difficult thing to do. In the event they took a more hands-off approach, I think that was the right thing to do. Now, in terms of the two debaters, you know, the problem with this, it was a very broad, is feminism good for the world? Too broad a remit, I think. And they weren't really debating one another on most of it. In fact, they weren't even ships that passed in the night. They were ships that never even passed in the night. There were ships that were sailing along different oceans in different directions in many ways. And on the one hand, you had Kristi Winters, and she was adopting an approach that, well, I'm going to highlight all the good that feminism has done, right? And leave it at that. And that's kind of, I know she likes Christopher Hitchens, and Christopher Hitchens gives an example of where people quote the good that Christianity does or the good that religion does as demonstrating that religion's a force for good. He quotes the example of Hamas and says, actually, Hamas does a lot of good in its communities. But if that gets away from the fact that overall it's a terrorist organisation, and isn't deserving of our abhorrence on the fact that it does good, and we should overlook all of that, then that's a little bit ridiculous. You've got to scope in the good and the bad, not just look at the good. The other end of the coin, Sargon of Akkad only looked at the bad, and largely in the sphere of media and online and universities, really, rather than looking in a more holistic sense. And so really there were like two ships that didn't pass in the night. They weren't really, many of the points we were making weren't in opposition to one another. And so they were both in themselves had some reasonable points. And so that kind of, I think that was the scope of the debate that was at fault there, along with some of these other bits that I'm going to be talking about with regard to feminism there. So that was a problem. Now, before I get on to that, what I know some people will say is, well, I'm interested to know where you stand on all of this, Jim. And it might surprise you to know that whilst there wasn't that much that Sargon said that I disagreed with, I side more on Kristi's side in that overall, and this kind of overall analysis was the kind of overall analysis in many ways that I was trying to do in my rape culture video that Kristi Winters was so dismissive of. And just as she was wrong on that occasion, she's wrong on this occasion. You need to take a balanced perspective. But on balance, I think that it does more good than bad. And I think that this is just something else. Rather than vilifying feminism, I actually think the men's rights movement, who have some substantial issues that affect men that they are taking on board, would be well to learn from feminism and some of the methods that feminism uses in getting its arguments out there and getting its arguments across. And that would be for the betterment of those issues than it would anything else. I think they could learn from feminism, in short, there. So that's kind of where I stand on that. If you want more on my position on feminism and all these issues, then I've got a video, Feminism and More. I'm not going to dwell more on that. What I want to talk about is three different things to do with feminism and how complicated the whole thing is. The first thing is that there are so many different things that fall under the scope of feminism that it's a bit of a fuck up to begin with. It's a bit of a fucking nightmare, really. I liken it, right, in some ways, rather than talking about feminism, we ought to talk about feminisms. And this is an idea I got off Dale Martin, Professor Dale Martin of Yale University. There is a marvellous course, I've mentioned it before, on early Christianity. It's a full foundational course on early Christianity that you can watch for free. About 30 lectures in the series. It's a Yale foundational course from Yale University on early Christianity. And he talks about, he says, don't think about early Christianity, think in terms of early Christianities, because there was so much variation of positions that eventually would be regarded as heterodox. But even in modern day Christianity, if you think of the positions that some Unitarians take versus some evangelical Christians versus some hardline Catholics, etc., you could still talk about modern day contemporary Christianities, and it might have more sense than talking about Christianity as if it's just some monolith. And it's the same thing with feminism. So it's a massive range of things, and I think this was the problem, is that one of the things that Kristi Winters did, which I thought was a bit disingenuous, was that she mentioned actually in the debate, and she also mentioned it when she did a hangout about Sargon of Akkad sometime in the past, was that she gave a definition of feminism which was concerned with women's issues and the issues of equality, where women have not reached a position of parity, either of opportunity or of outcome. That's kind of unclear, and of course that's different feminisms again being involved there in terms of goal and ideology, which we'll move on to in a bit. But so she's got that narrower definition, which I agree with. I think that's the right kind of definition. But at the same stage, she was quite happy. She kind of went around like a fucking tomcat, marking a territory, pissing on anything that she regarded as good. Right? Any good thing that had happened, well, that's feminism that did that, and that's feminism that did that. So, whereas championing, and this is the problem, there's so many feminisms. So, whereas, yes, there are feminists intersectional feminists who are championing the rights of trans people, there's a whole, it's given its own fucking category, TERFs, trans exclusionary radical feminists, a whole branch of feminism that is vigorously opposed to trans identities. And again, she talks about feminists championing men and men's issues there, and yet there are, just by the nature of feminism being feminism, it's bound to drag in some women who simply hate men, just the same as men's rights groups inevitably are going to drag in some men that hate women. It's just the way that's going to work, right? And you can't label the whole structure with regard to that, or the whole ideology with regard to that, but you've got to take account of it. So whilst there are those feminists that adopt those good positions, you also have feminists like Julie Bindel who adopt the position, and she said this within the last couple of years, that men should be kept in camps, in guarded camps, because men are not fit to take their place in society, and that women should be outside the camps and they should be allowed to go and visit their male relatives, but that's about as far as it goes. So you have this whole business of this kind of anti-male radical feminism and political lesbianism that is vigorously anti-male. So pretty much there's a feminist sect somewhere along the line that is going to fulfill whatever position you want it to fulfill. And that is a bit of an issue when it comes to taking credit for things. I'm sure most people would agree with that. The second is that feminism operates on so many different levels. Feminism is a series of goals, whether it's equality of outcome or equality of opportunity or something along those lines. It's a series of goals at root. But then it's also an ideology that underpins that and underpins the methods by which you think you're going to achieve that. And then it's a movement as well. It's the body of people that adopt that ideology and adopt those goals, or those ideologies and those goals, because they are different. There are different ideologies that you can have and different goals within feminism. And then we get into that murky water just with regards to ideology and movement that we get into with regards of religion, where where there's never any blame attached. This kind of Teflon coated thing where you can't blame the believers for what it says in scripture. You've got to judge the believers by what the believers do, but you can't blame the pure religion of scripture for the actions of the believers. And you've got the same kind of thing here with regard to the ideology and the movement. So if you point at what feminists are doing, you can, they can hold a hand up and say, well, yeah, that might be what feminists are doing, but that isn't properly feminism. And then if you criticise something that is properly feminism, well, that's not what feminists are actually doing. You need to be looking at what feminists are actually doing. So that is a problem that affects anything where you've got a movement or an ideology. And of course, that needs to be factored in here. And then finally, we've got this area of academic study. So we've got goals, ideology, movement, and academic study, and this whole business of feminist theory. And that brings me on then to what Kristi Winters, which was really a main point of concern of mine. And when I mean a point of concern, I don't mean just a concern with the debate. I mean a serious kind of concern that goes well beyond the debate, but into this entire area of social science and the study of gender here, if what Kristi Winters was saying is true, which was she portrayed feminist theory as the only game in town. And again, we're automatically now getting into this conflation between academic feminist study and feminist theory as a framework to study gender, and feminism as a series of goals and as an ideology and as a movement here. But she portrays that as the only game in town, and she makes the point that whenever you study gender, you're doing feminism. Right, and she doesn't seem to see a problem with that. Now, the first thing that I would say, I don't actually know, I'm not even going to comment on whether that's true or not, but what I'm aware of is that in the social sciences and in the study of gender, there is more than one framework which underpins it. There's more than one model that is used, I should say. And so you have models that go from entirely the constructionist model, which says that gender is entirely a social construction, through to much more biologically centered models, which obviously doesn't say that biology is everything, but says that biology has very much informs gender and gender identity there. So you have these very, very different models and a whole series of models in between. In fact, it was only last week when I made a book review video talking about the blank slate, and of course, in that book, Steven Pinker portrays the blank slate, the tabula rasa model, as the standard model in the social sciences, and he came in for some criticism with regard to that from people in these fields, such as the fields of gender studies, saying that's bullshit, that actually we don't just employ this very constructionist model, that there's a whole array of people working in these fields using an array of models, including models where biology very much informs gender and gender identity, etc. So that was the response to an academic making that point. So I think I've got a fair basis upon which to say that. But what that means then, if what Kristi Winters says is true, that means whatever model you use, if you are researching and investigating gender, you are doing feminism. Now you just think about what that is saying. What that's saying is that an entire area of scientific study is being overseen by a goal-driven ideology. Now, Kristi Winters doesn't seem very concerned about that, but there's a great deal to be concerned about that. Now, of course, we need a framework, just the same as evolutionary biology needs a framework, right? If you want to look at evolutionary biology, you have to have a framework, and that framework would be the modern synthesis, and so you've got the various components of natural selection and Mendelian inheritance and genes, and all that comes with that, right? To give you the understanding, to give you the framework and the model in which you can investigate biological things within that evolutionary framework, okay? So you have that. But that framework, the modern synthesis, is not goal driven. There's no end goal. Now, people that were into eugenics, eugenicists, they wanted to try and co-opt evolutionary biology into some goal-driven sphere, and we could all see the problems, the real dangers with that, couldn't we? And everybody railed against that. Now, I'm not likening feminism to eugenics. I think its goals are slightly not more higher-minded, but they're less dangerous than the goals of eugenics there. But nevertheless, there is a major concern, and the major concern is the same. It'd be the same as if we were to place the tobacco companies in charge of research, doing all the research in terms of the dangers of cigarette smoke. Is that there's an ideological bias there. There's a kind of bias current, and however good you are as a researcher and try and fight against it, that current is always there, and therefore it is inevitable. You can only fight it for so long, and not everybody else is going to fight it. So this is the problem here. Right, at the one stage you've got the science, the academic part, which should be descriptive, and at the same stage you've got these normative, goal-driven parts of feminism, which are all getting incorporated there. And when you perform some research, if the framework upon which you're performing that research has end goals, right, which is, even if it's a marvellous end goal like the equality of women, clearly, when you perform some research, some outcomes from that research are going to better fit with those particular goals than others, aren't they? There are going to be some which would be preferable results than others. Some of them are really going to kind of fuck things up from a goal-driven ideological perspective. And it's almost inconceivable that you can carry out research in that framework and not be influenced by the fact that those goals exist and those goals are underpinning everything that you do. So I'm not going to argue with what Kristi Winters says when she says that if you conduct gender research, you're doing feminism. What I'm going to say is, if that is the case, then Kristi Winters really ought to be wiping that smug fucking shit-eating grin off her face where she's saying it, because that ought to be a real area of concern, even if you are a feminist, because it is bound to colour any research that's done in its name. It's very much like any research that we know has been carried out by a left-wing think tank or a right-wing think tank. Again, these are organisations that are goal-oriented, that have an ideology underpinning them. You know, we're not really too fucking surprised, are we, when a right-wing think tank comes out with traditionally right-wing solutions to things and a left-wing think tank comes out with traditionally left-wing solutions to things. It would actually fucking blow us over, wouldn't it, if that didn't happen? And the reason is that we understand that if we don't separate goal and ideology from research and investigation, that we're not going to get a very neutral way of looking at things. And so that's really worrying, and that's where we need to take on board what I'm trying to get across here, which is that feminism exists on all these different levels. Kristi Winters can talk about it being an academic framework to study gender, but that doesn't stop it being a movement. It doesn't suddenly stop being an ideology. It doesn't suddenly stop being a series of goals as well. And those are things you want to keep just as far away as you can from the research that's being carried out. Well, that's pretty much all that I wanted to say. What I want to do, both parties have come in for some criticism for their performance here, but even though I've had my disputes with Kristi Winters, I want to doff my cap to both of them who took part in this, because it's quite a big undertaking to take part in a formal debate, especially taking part in it live like this online, when you know a great deal of people are going to be watching you, and everybody's going to be watching and scoffing and criticising and saying just how much fucking better they could have done it than you'd managed to do it. So hats off to both people for taking part in this, and I found it interesting, and what both of them had to say I found really interesting, even if I didn't agree with all of it. Okay, that's pretty much all that I wanted to say. What I'd also find interesting is to know what you thought about what I had to say. So that's all I'm going to say. Thank you for watching. Bye for now.